Afghanistan has long earned the title of the Graveyard of Empires, a phrase rooted not in poetic exaggeration but in historical fact. This rugged land has consistently defied foreign powers. From the armies of Alexander the Great to the military might of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, each came with ambition and left with scars. To understand why Afghanistan has never been truly conquered, one must trace the blood-soaked path of history, study its geography, and recognize the social and cultural patterns that have shaped its relentless defiance. The landlocked country is bounded by Iran to the west, Pakistan to the south and east, and the former Soviet republics of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan to the north. The terrain is dominated by the towering Hindu Kush Mountains that run northeast to southwest, a geographical spine that cuts the nation into isolated pockets. These mountains, along with vast deserts, narrow passes, and scattered fertile valleys, have always worked in favor of Afghan defenders and against foreign invaders. This geography makes large-scale military operations logistically nightmarish, while offering insurgents endless hiding places and vantage points for guerrilla tactics. Weather extremes only exacerbate the difficulties. Searing summers and punishing winters turn simple movement into a test of endurance. Resistance in Afghanistan begins deep in its past. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great arrived after defeating the Persian Achaemenid Empire. He encountered fierce resistance in Bactria and Sogdiana, regions corresponding to present-day northern Afghanistan. It took him over 2 years to secure partial control, and even then, he was forced to marry a Bactrian woman, Roxana, in an attempt to pacify local elites. His generals faced continuous uprisings even after his departure. The Macedonians would never fully pacify the region, and the echoes of that failed conquest still resonate in Afghan folklore today. Centuries later, in the 7th century CE, Muslim armies began their expansion into Central Asia. The Arabs managed to introduce Islam, but the process took centuries and was often met with resistance. The Saffarids of Sistan, who emerged in the 9th century, and the Ghaznavid Empire in the 10th and 11th centuries, were examples of local dynasties that embraced Islam but maintained regional autonomy. When Genghis Khan invaded in 1219, it marked another brutal chapter. The Mongols razed cities such as Herat, Balkh, and Bamiyan. But despite this devastation, Mongol authority eventually receded, and local powers like the Timurids rose from the ashes. In the 19th century, the British Empire, fresh from colonizing India, saw Afghanistan as a strategic buffer against Russian expansion into South Asia. This gave rise to the 3 Anglo-Afghan Wars. The first, from 1839 to 1842, was a catastrophic failure for the British. They invaded with 21,000 troops to reinstall Shah Shuja Durrani as a puppet king. While they initially succeeded, popular rebellion grew, and in January 1842, the British began a retreat from Kabul to Jalalabad. It turned into a massacre. Only one European survivor, Dr. William Brydon, reached safety. The British returned in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878 to 1880, following diplomatic tensions with Russia. After fierce fighting, they installed Abdur Rahman Khan as Emir in 1880, effectively controlling Afghan foreign policy while leaving internal matters to the Afghans. In the Third Anglo-Afghan War of 1919, King Amanullah Khan led a brief but successful campaign that culminated in the Treaty of Rawalpindi, granting Afghanistan full independence on August 19, 1919. The 20th century brought its own turmoil. The interwar years saw modernization efforts by Amanullah Khan, but tribal uprisings forced his abdication in 1929. The decades that followed were marked by power struggles between royalists and reformers. In 1973, King Zahir Shah was overthrown in a coup led by his cousin, Muhammad Daoud Khan, who declared Afghanistan a republic. 5 years later, in April 1978, the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, staged the Sour Revolution, overthrowing and killing Daoud. The PDPA, ideologically aligned with the Soviet Union, launched a radical modernization program, including land reforms and women's education. These policies sparked fierce resistance, particularly in rural areas. As the country descended into chaos, the Soviet Union intervened on December 24, 1979, sending in over 100,000 troops to support the PDPA regime led by Babrak Karmal. What was meant to be a short intervention turned into a decade-long quagmire. The Soviet army faced an increasingly organized insurgency, the Mujahideen, who used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and control of mountain passes to deadly effect. Backed heavily by the United States, Pakistan, China, and Saudi Arabia, The Mujahideen received billions in weapons, including the game-changing American FIM-92 Stinger missiles, which were introduced in 1986 and severely limited Soviet air superiority. Soviet casualties mounted. Over 15,000 killed, more than 35,000 wounded, and tens of thousands more traumatized. The economic and political cost helped accelerate the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. In February 1989, the Red Army withdrew, leaving a fragile Afghan regime behind. The post-Soviet era was no less destructive. The communist government of Mohammad Najibullah managed to hold out until 1992, when Mujahideen factions finally overran Kabul. However, these factions quickly turned on one another. Between 1992 and 1996, Afghanistan plunged into a brutal civil war. Kabul was shelled relentlessly as groups like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami, Ahmad Shah Massoud's Jamiat-e-Islami, and Abdul Rashid Dostum's Junbish-e-Milli fought for power. Lawlessness, looting, and atrocities became commonplace. Amid this chaos, a new force emerged: the Taliban. The Taliban movement began in Kandahar in 1994, composed largely of religious students educated in Deobandi madrasas across the Pakistani border. Led by Mullah Muhammad Omar, they promised to restore order and enforce strict Islamic law. They gained support through a combination of popular fatigue with the warlords, Pakistani backing, and swift military victories. By 1996, they had captured Kabul and executed former President Najibullah, hanging his body in public. The Taliban established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, enforcing an austere interpretation of Sharia law. Women were barred from schools and workplaces, public executions became common, and music, television, and photography were banned. Only 3 countries recognized the regime: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Their rule was marked by international isolation and internal repression until September 11, 2001, when al-Qaeda operatives launched a massive terrorist attack on the United States. Since al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan and protected by the Taliban, the U.S. issued an ultimatum: hand over Osama bin Laden or face consequences. The Taliban refused. On October 7, 2001, the United States and its allies launched Operation Enduring Freedom. With support from the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance, U.S. forces quickly toppled the Taliban regime by December 2001. A new era appeared to dawn. A transitional government was formed under Hamid Karzai in 2002, followed by presidential elections in 2004. Billions of dollars poured in for reconstruction. Yet, beneath the surface, the Taliban were regrouping. By 2005, Taliban fighters had returned to southern and eastern Afghanistan, launching ambushes, assassinations, and bombings. Their tactics evolved. Roadside IEDs and suicide bombers became common, and their shadow government began to reassert control in rural areas. The U.S. surge in 2009 under President Barack Obama increased troop levels to over 100,000 by 2010, but the gains were temporary. Despite killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in 2011, the war dragged on. Civilian casualties rose, corruption plagued Afghan institutions, and the Taliban continued to gain ground. Negotiations began in earnest in the late 2000s, culminating in the U.S.-Taliban agreement signed in Doha on February 29, 2020. The deal called for a phased withdrawal of U.S. troops in exchange for Taliban promises to prevent terrorism and enter peace talks with the Afghan government. But those talks stalled. As U.S. forces began withdrawing rapidly in 2021, the Taliban launched a lightning offensive. Provincial capitals fell one after another in July and early August. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul without resistance, marking the end of a 20-year war and the beginning of their second rule. Afghanistan's legacy of resistance proves that no empire, however powerful, can outlast the fierce will of a people determined to defend their land.